warm welcome back to the Corporate Sustainability Education channel. We are your weekly education podcast. We stream a new one for you every Friday, and we're powered by the Southern Sustainability Partnership. Now, we're delighted to bring you the fifth in our series of podcasts with Martin Baxter, who is Head of Policy and External Affairs at the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, otherwise known to a lot of us as IEMA. Martin, we're delighted to have you back with us, and you are going to be talking us through the government's new UK environmental bill, which has been designed on the back of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. Martin, welcome and thank you for coming back.
Well, thanks. Great to be joining you again, Linda. It's quite a few of these we've been doing now, and it's always been good fun.
I know. We should stop meeting like this over the airwaves, but they've been so hugely popular that, you know, we've got one more in the series with you. We'll give you a little break and then maybe we'll try and talk you to come back. But yeah. Okay, so let's get started. So I think it's important that not all of us are going to know exactly what the government's environmental bill is. So I was wondering if you could just give us a summarise, really, what the environmental bill is and what it means to the country, and you know, anything that it might mean for our businesses going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it is well, it's a major piece of legislation. So when the UK voted to leave the EU and we've left EU policymaking, about 80% of our environmental laws and regulations were rooted in European directives and regulations. And having now left the EU, then we need to have the legal structures in place to be able to develop our own environmental policy and the regulations that go with that. And so that's one of the reasons why the new Environment Bill is coming through Parliament at the moment. And the bill has two broad areas, and then each of those, within those areas, there are major elements which constitute this new governance framework. So on the one hand, there's a big governance elements on how we're going to govern and manage, you know, the development of environmental policy going forward. So that section of the bill has a requirement that government has to develop long-term legally binding environmental targets, put those targets into law by no later than the end of October 2022. There'll be targets in the areas of resource efficiency and waste, biodiversity, water, and air quality. Separately, there will be, and those targets, the long-term aspects of those targets need to be at least 15 years into the future. So the first set of targets that are set through that process will have a target end date by 2037, i.e., forget that right. So that's 15 years, at least 2037, could be longer. And then as well as part of that, then they'll set some interim targets as milestones as well, so that we kind of know whether we're going to be on track. On top of that, there'll also be a legally binding ambient air quality target for the fine particulate matter, so those are 2.5 ppm. Really, really important because those are the pollutants which get into bloodstreams, really damaging to human health. So there'll be a new legally binding ambient air quality target for that. And as the bill has been going through Parliament, then there's been another legally binding target that's going to be in place for 2030, which is aimed at addressing species decline, so a species abundance target. There's still kind of discussions about exactly how that will be done, but and whether there might be some changes on the face of the bill to kind of crystallize that target a little bit more. But yeah, so there's that target setting process in the bill. There's a new policy statement on environmental principles. So this is going to be binding on not just DEFRA ministers, but ministers in other government departments, except for Defence and Treasury, but all the others will have to have due regard to this policy statement when they're developing their own policies. And these principles include the polluter pays principle, the pollution prevention principle, the precautionary principle that you should integrate environmental considerations into policy making. So that policy statement is also kind of written into the bill, and governments started to consult on that. And then there's the creation of a new Office for Environmental Protection. So a new green watchdog, which will have both a scrutiny and advisory role for government. So looking at government's progress towards achieving the targets. Plus, really importantly, it will monitor the implementation of environmental law, and it will have the power to enforce public authorities if they fail to properly implement or fulfill their functions under an environmental law, including being able to take action through the courts. So that's just like the governance part of this bill. And then when you get into the other part of the bill, which is massive as well, then there is whole new sections on say in the biodiversity chapter on biodiversity net gain for new developments. There's an environmental due diligence requirement being developed for forestry commodity products. There's new local nature recovery strategies being developed, conservation covenants. So there's kind of major aspects of biodiversity on resource efficiency and waste. There's extended producer responsibility, so looking to take more action to, particularly targeted on plastic waste and packaging. And conceptually what's happening there is that there will be a charge put on producers. So if you can imagine at the moment, you and I pay for packaging disposal through our council tax bill. And what government is doing, and so there's no real massive incentive for the producers of that material who are putting it onto the market to kind of take the real action. So what's happening is that there's going to be a big charge put on the producers, and then that will be used to subsidize local authorities. So that instead of us paying for that pollution through our council tax bill, we should be paying for it in our choices that we make when we buy. All sorts of other things in the resource efficiency and waste section. So there's deposit return schemes, there's charges on single-use items. There's a whole new section on the resource efficiency aspect. So particularly looking at the role of eco-design, providing more information to consumers about the repairability, recyclability of products, product durability, so how long the product's going to last. So information being provided to consumers, and then on top of that, producers and developers of new products also potentially having regulations about material choices, around production methods. So and then there's sections on air quality and on water quality as well. So you can see this is a huge piece of legislation. 244 pages when it was first published, and it's now, I think it's at 266. So there have been new additions added as it's been going through the parliamentary process. Once we do get it onto the statute book, and we can maybe discuss about that later on, then there'll be a whole set of new regulations, so statutory instruments, to implement the finer detail of all of these new measures and mechanisms. So it's a huge piece of legislation.
And you can see that it has an impact on everyone. It has an impact on us who live, in this country, on the land in this country. It has an effect on species. I'm so glad to hear, species decline. It obviously will have an impact on our businesses, what you've alluded to there, it's clear to see. But actually, not one thing that you've mentioned in that is not so hugely important to our country and really every country going forward. And when I say about every other country, I did read that this is the most ambitious environmental programme of any country on earth. Is that true? And did you think that's amazing, it needs to be? Or did you also think, my goodness, that's a lot to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, the bill is definitely ambitious, but ambition without action is meaningless. And I think, the real question is, how do you go from developing long-term legally binding targets? What are the mechanisms and the levers that can be pulled to ensure that what happens on the ground actually drives the right type of change in the way in which we want to see, and that will achieve the longer term outcomes that we're looking for? And there's a lot of work going on at the moment thinking about how you not just sign up to lots of legally binding targets, because to be frank, I mean, we've done that and we are failing to achieve what we should be achieving. So you think about our failure to hit all of our air quality targets, the water quality and ecological status of natural waterways in England is absolutely appalling. Only about 14% meet our water quality objectives. So kind of we've consistently failed to hit what we should have done. And so what we've been doing is working very closely with a lot of the business groups, as well as the environmental NGOs, to try and develop the mechanisms and really get buy-in for ownership and of delivering these targets. Because without that, then I think we'll just end up in 10 years' time thinking, well, we're not going to hit these targets, and that's a complete waste of time. So yeah, there's a lot of thought going into that to try and get the investment and the change that's going to be needed to achieve those longer term outcomes. So when you look at the state of the environment in the UK, we've had massive species decline. The state of our natural environment is really quite poor and hasn't been improving in anything like the measures that we need. And we can't keep eroding our natural capital. We can't keep, if we destroy the capability of our soil to support thriving biodiversity and be productive for agriculture, you can't get it back once you've destroyed it. So we really, really do need to think long and hard about, well, not just think long and hard about what action needs to be taken, but actually to take that action. So yeah, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, I think with a government initiative, it's very easy for people to think, well, they can talk the talk, but how often do they walk the walk? And like you say, with us failing to meet certain targets already that have been laid out for some time, we don't want people to be turned off by the fact that this could be another one of those, because this has to happen now, doesn't it? And I think there's lots of areas around the country where you look at biodiversity and people are commenting on the amount of building work that's going on with new homes and that is another government-led initiative to, we need more housing. But then, of course, there's a lot with our natural capital and that needs to come into account if that is what we're going to be doing. And I was wondering, Martin, whether the government with this huge document has started from scratch, or is this sort of a reiteration of something that they'd already had existing or had already had ambitions to make happen?
Yeah, well, great question. And I think, so government in 2017 published its 25-year environment plan, which set out what it was going to try to achieve, but it didn't actually have all the mechanisms in place to be able to do that. So it set, long-term goals around environmental net gain for new developments, around turning around the decline of species, around tackling waste and resources, and improving resource productivity. So lots of good words in that plan, but not really an effective delivery plan at that point in time, I don't think, and not really having all the mechanisms in place to deliver that. So what the Environment Bill does is create that framework that should be capable of delivering on the ambitions that we have, which is not just to slow and halt the decline of our natural environment, but actually getting to rejuvenating and replenishing it and becoming more of a restorative economy. So that's that's where this is, and I think I've been working on this bill probably since 2018. So it's kind of 2017 we started back end, I think. So we've been going quite a long time on this. And the bill will put that 25-year plan on a statutory footing, but it will then have all the mechanisms that are going to be needed, or what we think are going to be needed, to actually deliver it. And then the hard work really starts when we've got those mechanisms in place to actually use them properly.
So, as head of policy at IEMA, I was going to ask you, what form does that take? What is your involvement like with the government over this?
Yeah, I mean, I've had meetings with the last three secretaries of state in DEFRA about this bill, and ministers in Treasury and elsewhere in DEFRA. Back in 2019, we published a blueprint for the Environment Act. So as part of IEMA's Home to the Broadway initiative, and we got together a group of individuals late 2017, early 2018, to say, okay, we need to take this moment which is kind of unfrozen, and lots of things have the potential to change at the moment. And we can, as the UK was leaving the EU, and so what we thought would be a good idea would be to develop a blueprint for how we should manage and improve the environment going forward. So we published that in a blueprint and worked quite closely with government to get their buy-in for that, and to try and convince them that putting an ambitious environment bill onto the statute was the right thing to do. So we had meetings, like I say, with Secretary of State. Had a meeting with Ministry with Theresa May's special advisor. We had meetings with Philip Hammond and Michael Gove in Downing Street, in number 11 Downing Street, where we took a small group of us went and met to make the case about what the ambition should be for a major new piece of legislation. So I think we've done quite a lot in terms of helping to firstly create the space where government could step in to say, yes, they can see that there is support across both the environmental NGO community and the business community. And actually, the majority of what we're asking for is the same. So that then creates, a platform for government to come through with the bill. Secondly, then, some of the detailed mechanisms within the bill, we've had, lots of discussions with government. We published a paper that a couple of us put together on objectives and targets for the bill and the framework for that, which pretty much all of that has been picked up and put into the bill in one way or another. So we've had quite a lot of effect in that context. So lots of discussions, and those continue with senior officials to try and get that, help them to understand what can be achieved, why it's important, particularly from a business perspective, because I think the reality is that the majority of the changes that we need to see and the investments that need to be made in improving the natural environment, you look at the state of the public finances, and there's not going to be a lot of money to spend from the government. So we need to think about how do we create the incentives and the structures for private sector finance and investment to fund the changes that are needed, and therefore what's the policy framework that will give them certainty to do that. And that's what we've tried to create through this bill. So that's been part of what we've done. I've given evidence before parliamentary committee bills in the House of Commons. In fact, that was my last meeting in London since before the lockdown was being screwed before the bill committee. We gave an evidence session on the new environmental watchdog with the House of Lords committee. So that was back in 2020, I think. Get my data. So it could have even been 2019. More recently, we've had meetings with government ministers on different aspects of this to help them to have the confidence to push ahead with the bill. So yeah, and we haven't finished yet. So the bill is currently in the House of Lords, moving into report stage. and we expect it to formally get royal assent and come onto the statute book in autumn this year. So, and then the hard work really begins, translating all of that legislation into action on the ground. So.
Politicians have a huge learning curve, don't they? And their officials, because they are not in these jobs forever. They, they take on these roles, and, without people like yourselves, and without the knowledge and expertise within IEMA and other, organisations, I mean, it must be a huge eye opener for them to see what needs to be done, what can be done, and also in the timeframes. And they obviously in this juxtaposition of knowing that this is so vitally important to to us as people, human beings, to the planet, but also to our businesses, with trying to balance an economy and get a healthy economy and a strong economy. So yes, it's very difficult, really, and you realise more than most probably exactly what it is that they're going through. So I wondered, Martin, how will the items covered in this bill feature in UK policy making to ensure that it makes the difference it's intended for?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, because you use the phrase UK, and I think because we have devolved governments in the UK, and we have and they have legislative powers, then we have an Environments Act for Wales already, and Wales also has its Future Generations and Wellbeing Act. So some aspects of this bill do apply across the whole of the UK, but some of it only applies to England, some of it applies to England and Northern Ireland. So it's quite complex, the bill, in terms of understanding each provisions and the territorial extent of them. So that's kind of something that people need to be aware of. I think in terms of translating all of this into action and thinking about what will drive that. I mean, firstly, some aspects about legal compliance. I mean, we mentioned home building earlier on, and from probably 20, well, I'm not entirely sure what date it'll be at the moment, but so for example, from 2023, if new development has to be 10% biodiversity net gain as a bare minimum, so there will be new regulations that come through. There'll be changes to the Town and Country Planning Act that require, when you submit your planning application for a new, say, housing development or a new industrial development, you will have had to go and assess the current state of biodiversity in that area using a new metric that's been developed. And then you apply that metric to also the plans that you have for your new development. And you've got to be able to demonstrate that the new development will result in a 10% increase in biodiversity as a result of your development. So you either have to put additional measures into your development to enhance biodiversity, or you need to purchase a biodiversity credit from somewhere else that has had a biodiversity improvement put onto it. So I think the mechanisms that are in the bill that are coming through will actually drive the action that's needed. Now, whether in combination, I mean, there's always uncertainty with all of these things, but I'm definitely hopeful that we can turn the tide. If I wasn't hopeful, I would have given in a long time ago.
Well, you certainly see it from a different side to a lot of us, and we're so lucky to have your enthusiasm and drive for it, that's for sure. But I do think quite often that building developers must love people like us, because like you say, with the biodiversity and all the new things they've got to take into account, they never had to before. And then you look at, what we tried to get them to do with renewable energy, etc. It's a whole new level, a whole new playing field for them out there, isn't it? But
Well, I think what's been what I've seen recently, I don't know whether you've seen it, is the Future Homes Task Force has just published its plan. It's really good to see, because what they've done is they've mapped out what are all the environment and climate and expectations on new homes of the future. So homes of the future, they need to be net zero in their operation. They need to probably generate their own power through the renewables. They will probably need to have the capability to charge an electric vehicle and to swap electricity between the vehicle and the home. They will need to be incredibly efficient in their consumption of water. So they'll probably have to kind of have blue water and grey water systems in place. They'll need to deliver 10% biodiversity net gain. They'll need to be constructed in a net zero manner. They'll probably need to have net zero components in embedded carbon. Okay, so in total, that's what we're expecting our new homes to deliver. And so what the Future Homes Task Force has done is collaborated between all of the different elements that have these interdependencies. So for example, you've got the home builders, you've got the construction product manufacturers, you've got the water companies, you've got the electricity, you've got people dealing with mobility, all coming together to say, okay, how do we go from where we are today to where we want to be, and how quicker can we get there? So there's kind of a plan has been put together, a new hub's coming out in September, but that will then drive the changes that will be needed across the whole of the supply chain, so that we can deliver. You know, the government's ambition is for 300,000 new homes to be built every year, and we need all of them to be climate and environment climate proof, net zero enabled, kind of sustainable homes, and they need to be affordable. And we need to have people who can construct them with the skills to do that. And ideally, we want to have the supplies of the new equipment into these homes to be to support, you know, new green jobs in the UK economy. So kind of working through the timescales of all of this to be able to deliver reliably at scale is kind of is work that's happening. And actually that's been framed around the work in the Environment Bill and the net zero target, from those companies saying, we know we've got to do it. We now need a consolidated plan about how we're going to get there. And then we need to be held to account for delivering it. So
there really is an opportunity, isn't there, for the larger probably development companies who can steal the march on this, really, with how much building, like you say, there is required. And you know, I think it's our job also to let them realise that see the positive in doing this, rather than often the negative. They see it as it's going to cost them more money to develop these properties, and that's not always the case. But I think also to actually look differently at the people that are building, constructing these things. I don't think they always get the best press, the best views of people out there. And I think, they've got some important work to do over the next few years. So I think it's just changing mindsets, really. But it's exciting, I think, to see what is going to happen and to future-proof our homes for years to come. It's just, it's incredible. I'm quite fascinated. Obviously, I see that the bill, the Environment Bill, will have royal assent. And I'm just quite interested to know exactly what that means.
So, so the government publishes its legislative timetable, and as part of that, it's in the Queen's speech. It sets out what bills it's going to take through Parliament. So it put the Environment Bill into Parliament. It goes through a process then of being consulted on within government, within Parliament. So there are debates on the floor of the House when the bill has what's called its first and second reading. So that's when you can start to get the views of MPs. Select committees look at the bill and give their opinion on it. And then you get into potentially having amendments to the bill. So can we improve the bill? So the government publishes the bill. It's its best effort at that point in time. You have members of Parliament going through it, scrutinising it. Then once that's all done, you sometimes get amendments which are put in. They can be government amendments, or they can be voted on in Parliament. And Parliament can say, we want to change this. Obviously, when government's got a big majority at the moment, government holds sway generally on that, so it has kind of quite a powerful hand, but nevertheless has made some changes to the bill that in discussion and dialogue within Parliament, it has seen that it can improve, and stakeholders have had the opportunity to speak to parliamentarians to lay down proposed amendments. So once it's gone through first stage in the House of Commons, it then goes to the House of Lords. That's where it is at the moment. It's in the House of Lords. There's what's called the report stage, is due first or second week in September, and then the Lords will probably come up with a list of things they want to see amended. Government can decide whether it wants to take those amendments or reject them. Then it goes back to Parliament to have another review of what's been, where's the bill at. You have this stage called ping pong, where it can go backwards and forwards between House of Commons, House of Lords, House of Commons, House of Lords, and it goes back to the House of Commons to vote, do we accept this bill? Is it going on the statute vote, yes or no? Once that vote has happened, and assuming that it will be positive, and I have no doubt that it will be positive on the Environment Bill, it then goes to, the Queen kind of signs it off with royal assent, and then that bill has come into legal force. So it only has legal force once it's got royal assent. And at that point, it goes from being a bill to an Act of Parliament. It's being an Act of Parliament that gives it the legislative status, if you like, as a law, and then that's, can be upheld through the courts. And as a law, it has duties on secretaries of state and government to do things by a certain date, or other people to do things by a certain date. It also creates powers. Now, some of the mechanisms in the bill will come into effect immediately on royal assent, and then some of them have enactment through new regulations. So as I said, the creation of the Office for Environmental Protection will happen as soon as the bill gets royal assent. It will come into legal existence, whereas biodiversity net gain only comes into effect once the statutory instruments have been laid in Parliament, or the long-term legally binding targets have got to go through a process of development, which is currently underway at the moment, and there will be a statutory instrument, so a new regulation that has those targets in, and that has to be voted in Parliament, and there'll be a debate about those in Parliament before getting accepted or potentially rejected, and coming onto the statute book. So that transition from this being an environment bill where things can be changed at the moment to actually having a legally enforced statute is the process we're going through at the moment.
If you believe what you read in the media, then it would be fair to say that our royal family have quite a bit to say when it comes to the environment. And I think this is something that they would definitely take very seriously. And I wouldn't put it past Her Majesty to have read every page in that environmental bill. I was wondering, therefore, who the bill is aimed at in terms of meeting targets. And it would be very easy to think, that the large organisations, if we look at it from a business perspective, the large organisations are going to be hit, they're going to have certain targets to meet. So going down the line then, how SMEs that might be listening to this, are they off the hook? Is it going to be a long time before it's going to come to them as smaller organisations, or are we all going to see that we've got a stake in this quite soon?
Well, I think everybody will see that they will have a stake in it. Some of it will become for your home life. So, for example, at the moment, you and I probably we live in different parts of the country, so we've almost certainly got different domestic home recycling requirements, which makes it really, really complex for manufacturers putting, packaging on and materials onto the market to say, when you've used this, put it into this bin. Well, they can't, because you and I have got different bins. So one of the things that the bill does is create an obligation to have 6 separate types of waste collected from domestic properties across the whole of the country. Suddenly that can transform the way in which we kind of maybe start to deal with waste, improve quality of waste. So that might drive change that you would see over a period of time, depending on when that gets implemented, that suddenly, I will have different waste bins that will be collected from my home. And that will be an absolute, that will be a change. There will be some things which might impact on not just large businesses, but small businesses. So an example could be, again, just thinking about, waste, the plastic bag charge has been extended to not just large supermarkets, but smaller outlets as well. So some aspects will have, potentially have a direct link to SMEs as well as large businesses. It depends on what target or the nature of the targets and what the link is between a company's activities and those targets. So, for example, it's likely that there will be a national resource productivity target, and also there will be a residual waste target. So it's likely that there'll be a lot of action to stimulate stopping kind of waste going to landfill or being incinerated. Okay, so that might then change disposal options that organisations have, and therefore that might lead them to think about how they use materials more wisely and more efficiently in their companies. The creation of air quality, tackling air quality might limit certain activities in cities, particularly around transport. So again, that could then not just impact on large businesses, but potentially smaller businesses. So it's quite difficult in some of the targets. So if you think about the biodiversity and a species abundance target, understanding what changes need to be put in place to drive an improvement in species abundance, depend on what species, whereabouts, kind of what's the spatial extent, and then thinking about what are the economic sectors and drivers that need to be understood to be able to make the change. So it might be, a lot of this will probably come on to landowners, land managers. So our water quality targets will be, to a large extent, determined by the extent inputs onto agricultural land, so phosphates and nitrates. So that's something that's going to have to be tackled. The Agriculture Act creates new environmental land management schemes, so incentives in terms of subsidies for environmental benefits are likely to come in to help to kind of move towards lower environmental impact agriculture. So there's a lot to do, and I think that's one of the challenges, that we've spoken to government about in creating these new targets. The net zero target for climate change is really easy for every organisation if they want to relate to it. If we're all on a net zero transition, then we can look at our own footprint and we can say, right, where do we need to be? What bits of our business need to change to become, part of the, this race to zero? But it's a lot harder to have that line of sight between a biodiversity target or maybe a water quality target. So that's some of the, the slightly more challenging work that has to happen to make this as clear to businesses as we possibly can about what their obligations are going to be.
So will it solely be the role of the government to oversee this and to look at accountability of implementation if it doesn't happen? And also, do you think that it will lead to fines, people paying penalties for not reaching certain things? Has it sort of gone that far?
So two things. So one is that once the targets are set in law, there's a legal duty on the Secretary of State to ensure that the targets are met. And the new Office for Environmental Protection will have the power to take enforcement action if targets are missed. And there are mechanisms that the Secretary of State has to take to ensure that the targets are met. So kind of, and come up with the plans and policies to achieve that. When you kind of then get down into, okay, well, if we've got a national target on a particular aspect, government then might say, well, in order to meet that target, so in order to start to get to restoring biodiversity and halting species decline, biodiversity net gain is coming in, then a developer is going to have to make sure that they can demonstrate that their development will enhance biodiversity by at least 10%. Otherwise, they won't get planning permission for their development. And if local authorities offer planning permission without that happening, then they could, as a public authority, be enforced by the Office for Environmental Protection. So there are the mechanisms that are coming in to provide that framework to support delivery, not by coercion and threat, although that does kind of lie behind it, but actually just by making this the sensible business case. And so that's where the work is happening to try and get the right economic trajectory on the targets, as well as the science-based aspects to the targets, bring those together to say, how much will it, what needs to change? When does it need to change by? How much, what does this mean in terms of existing investment cycles for business? So when could they make the changes just by ordinary business as usual kind of investments? What's the gap between where that would get us to and where we actually want to be? And then you think about, okay, well, what other incentives or mechanisms need to be put in place to ensure that we can close that gap in the timescales that we're looking at. So that work is happening at the moment on the development of those legally binding targets, and we're expecting consultation probably October, November time from government on what those legally binding targets will be. And we've been doing some work to understand what sectors might be impacted by that, so that we can understand in total what's the total contribution for each sector to be able to hit all of these environmental goals.
When professionals in the industry sectors, it's their responsibility within their organisation to be up to speed with this. Will IEMA be running webinars, training courses, that sort of thing? Is that a good place to start to learn about, exactly what this is going to mean for them?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing, as you can imagine, we've been doing webinars on the bill. We also published a primer about the bill, so a document that just outlined the key features so that people could understand them. Once the bill gets rather sent and it's completed its passage through Parliament, then we'll provide a more detailed document, kind of summarising and providing some analysis and giving people an insight into what the changes might need to be able to kind of keep this going. And secondly, we're involved in the development of the targets on the policy statement on environmental principles. We've had dialogue with the Office for Environmental Protection about what its strategy and approach might be. And then we'll keep communicating that back to IEMA members so that they are in best possible shape to meet their obligations and expectations.
Yeah. So how do you think, in your opinion, Martin, how do you feel that the bill's been received generally?
I think generally people have said that this is a major piece of legislation and has got pretty much most of the features that you would expect to see in a world-leading bill. I think, we've been working on potential amendments to see whether we can improve some things and get greater clarity. But generally, I think this is, it's a good bill, and it will drive change, and that change should be really positive. But it will be contingent on us all kind of working collaboratively to achieve those long-term outcomes. So I think that's the bit that getting this onto the statute book is one thing. Working those processes that the bill establishes really hard and getting the best out of them is something that we will be really focused on as well. And then instead of sitting here in 10 years' time thinking, crikey, we're not going to achieve these targets, it's where we're on track and we're going to have much better environment, cleaner air, cleaner water, more thriving wildlife, access to urban green space for people, etc., etc. And that should really improve people's quality of life.
It's down to us, it's down to our businesses, and also, what we're creating for our future generations as well. It's all down to us now, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, Martin, thank you very much for clarifying, the stages of where this bill is at now. And I think suffice to say that, it can seem a lot to take in, but there is a lot of help out there. And certainly as an IEMA member, that's a good place to start. And, you've got information on the website already that is there to watch. And obviously you're the people that are going to keep everybody up to date with what's happening. So thank you very much, Martin, once again for joining us.
Thanks, Linda. Really enjoyed our chat.
And you can, as always, get a link to the IEMA website so you can take a look at the environmental bill information that they've got on there already, see what webinars or training, whatever that might be coming up. Also, as I keep saying, do please come along and meet Martin in person at the Big Sustainability Expo on the 28th of October. You'll find him in the Keynote Speaker Theatre. And in the meantime, thank you so much again for watching, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.